Good morning, everybody. Welcome to all of you to this session on development of radio. So we have two sessions, half an hour each, and in these two sessions, I will take you through the mesmerizing story of radio. So this is more of a storytelling session, and I will show you how we proceed. So in this session, we're going to first look at the radio's history, the international perspective on it, and then we're going to counter with the Indian perspective of the development of radio, followed by how radio was in colonial times, and then state involvement. The rest of the story will continue in the second session. So to introduce the subject to you, I would like to recapitulate, and so far we have looked at the growth and development of media, the history of journalism and mass communication, how media grew in the world and in the Indian context, and also how journalism came into being, also including the vernacular press and the vernacular dailies. Then the history of development of technology was talked about in the previous sessions. And then we all understand that media rediscover themselves according to the demand and the necessity of time. So as per the demand of time, as per the necessity of time, media recapitulates media, takes another garb media, rediscovers itself, and comes into an altogether new avatar whereby it becomes more relevant in the society and is able to play a greater, more important kind of a role. Now let us look at radio's history. Talking about the international perspective, radio became prominent basically during the World War II, and it was used in military activities to communicate from one base to another and carried orders and commands of the military journals for their armies. And they were also able to gauge what the enemy is doing and what kind of music is playing and what is the various kinds of information which was confidential could be shared through it in codes. The technological development of radio was regarded as one revolutionary discovery of the modern world. In 1887, there was this German scientist by the name of Heinrich Rudolf Hertz, who demonstrated that electromagnetic waves can be transmitted through space. So his name got attached to denote the unit of radio frequencies, and so we measure the unit of radio frequencies in hertz. Italian engineer Guglielmo Marconi received the first transatlantic wireless signal from England to the Newfoundland way back in 1901. So in the US in 1910, inventor Lee D. Frost conducted live radio broadcast from the Metropolitan Opera House in New York, and it is regarded as the landmark wireless voice and music transmission. These random developments in various levels added to the growth of radio as a medium of the masses and for the masses. In the West, the development of radio as the medium of dissemination of information was taken quite seriously. In fact, with the development of commercial broadcasting, public service broadcasting was also taken up by the state quite sincerely. The history of public service broadcasting is generally traced to British Broadcasting Corporation, what we know for short as BBC of England. The thrust of public service broadcasting is still very relevant in the third world countries where privatization, though it has taken over the competition front and the competition arena on a huge scale, but yet public service broadcasting remains relevant. But in some countries, it has been relegated to being the mouthpiece of the state rather than representing the public or informing or making them aware. With the United Nations Project of Information and Communication Technology for Development, in short we call it ICT 4D, radio has gained immense importance in the modern globalized world. However, it is important that radio adapts to the new and challenging conditions. Now let us look at radio's history from the national perspective. Radio came to India during the British rule in the guise of an amateur experiment. In 1920, the Bombay Presidency Radio Club was established by support of Gyachand Motwane. He is also credited with the honor of being the first to record and broadcast radio programs in India. A few months before the Radio Club in Bombay, British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, was given a go-ahead to launch a public service programming across Britain by the British government in January 1927. The state involvement started later, and when India got independence, the baton of radio was passed from one government to the other. Now let us look at radio during colonial times. Radio in India was an amateurish experiment, as we've already stated. The venture of Motwane lasted only for one day. The next year, in a joint venture between the newspaper Times of India and Post and Telegraph Office, another station was launched in Bombay. The signals were received 100 miles away in Pune, and the third station with the power of 750 kilohertz and a 1.5 kilowatt transmitter was started in Bombay after 2 years. Bombay had a fourth station when Walter Rogers' company started one with the call sign of 2AX. It was more of an Adventist church venture. On the eastern region in Calcutta, the Marconi Company of England conducted a number of test broadcasts in various locations, and eventually the Calcutta Radio Club loaned a transmitter from Marconi Company and started their radio station in November 1923 with a call sign of 2BZ. The West Bengal government too loaned a transmitter from Marconi Company and launched a station with another call signs of 5AF. The Madras Presidency Radio Club under the call sign of 2GR started operating in 1924 with Viscount Goshen, the governor of Madras, as patron during those times. This station closed down in 1927 due to financial constraints, and the transmitter was donated to the Corporation of Madras. Now there were two stations, one in Madras and one in Bangalore. The station in Madras was operated by the Crompton Electric Company, and both the stations were operating in 1926. There was also a 1-watt station which was established by a postal official at his home in Hyderabad way back in 1933. So people during those times were very keen with experimenting with this new medium called radio, which could through sound waves transmit their signals, their language, their messages from one place to another over a distance of a few hundred miles. Now let us look at the state involvement and the way state shaped up things. State involvement in broadcasting began when Government of India signed a contract with a private company named Indian Broadcasting Company, which was IBC for short, in 1927, and this allowed them to bring experimental broadcasting in Bombay and Calcutta, both the places, simultaneously. This was the same time that following the publication of the Crawford Report, which was released on 2nd of March 1926, the BBC was launched on 1st of January 1927, which was supposed to be a non-commercial and Crown chartered kind of a service. In fact, by 1926, it was already being discussed in the government about formalizing the system and structures of broadcasting. It is said that the rules of the radio clubs were brought to a forced end as IBC thought that the sale of radio license could earn them a handsome revenue. So they ensured that nobody else has a radio license. In fact, Fieldon had written in his book, Broadcasting in India, how the most successful of India's radio clubs, the Madras Presidency Radio Club, was finally forced to close down in October 1927. However, setting up the first operational transmitters in Bombay and Calcutta took 1 year, and considerable cost was incurred. Even the company was also underfinanced with only £42,000 at that time. The company could not sell as many licenses as they had thought they would, and due to which they curbed the procurement of licenses by other agencies and individuals. only 3,594 licenses were issued by the end of 1927. India's geographical reality also came in the way. We have mountains, we have plateaus, we have plains. So, everywhere the electromagnetic waves are not able to reach without any disturbance or noise incurring in them. And it was a vast geographical area when we talked about India that we were looking at, and the area which had no electricity. Thus, the company started to feel increasingly that the realities of Britain were not the same as those in India. So, India had a different terrain, India had different social problems and absence of electricity, and all of it would affect the broadcasting process. BBC, which was operating on the same commercial monopoly agreement between the year 1922 and 1926, was expanding rapidly in Britain, which was not the case in India. However, IBC by 1930 had opened only 2 small transmitters and had issued less than 8,000 licenses. Moreover, programs were also mostly in English. In fact, Secretary of State Lord Birkenhead had written to Lord Irwin in a personal letter that IBC should make program for English speaking population. That is to say, the Europeans and the educated Indians of the cities totally ignoring the masses. Thus, in spite of government support, IBC turned out to be a financial failure. Ultimately, in 1930, the IBC went into liquidation and was forced to shut shop before the completion of the 4th year. However, if you look at the broadcasting activities in India before 1930, it would be obvious that a lot of speculative business was taking place in the area. For example, shipping of radio sets and transmitters, etc. These people, along with the programmers and the public, put pressure on the government, and then the government yielded and took over the Bombay and Madras stations in April 1930. Government of India decided to purchase the assets of IBC, and those were placed under the control of Department of Industry and Labour. 1930 was also a very important time because this was also the time of civil disobedience movement, and the government could see the potential of the newly redesignated Indian State Broadcasting Services, the ISBS, being utilized in the consolidation of the Indian state as well as of political unity. So, the government feared this. The post-war Great Depression had also had an effect on the financial condition of the government, the British government in India. The financial difficulty and the lack of real enthusiasm on the part of government to continue with broadcasting led to the closure of IBC in October 1931. The rumor in Britain was that the radio stations of Bombay and Calcutta might be sold to the American commercial interest. The Federation of British Industry was visibly worried, and they lobbied in the India office against the sell-off. Representations and agitations compelled the government to go back to the orders on November 23, 1931, doubling the cess on the radio sets. The 1932 was the year when the British Broadcasting Corporation started an empire service, and it resulted in the doubling of the sale of receiving sets in less than 2 years. All these sets were imported at that time. The increase in collections of license fees and import duty on the sets and components of the radio sets also resulted in the increase of government's revenue. So, while basically government was in a financial strain, it was looking at generating greater revenue. At the same time, it saw radio as one media of mass communication that could impact the masses in large numbers and on various aspects like the political aspects, because the entire India was arising towards the cause of getting its freedom. However, it should be remembered that though the number of licenses increased, it still remained confined to the elite, because the programming was not done for the masses. This picture of financial viability of broadcasting culminated in the government's decision to start a radio station in Delhi, and the Delhi station went on air on January 1, 1936. I hope that you're finding this history quite interesting. This development was very important as radio began to be used as an indispensable medium of propaganda, and this was directed at two enemies of the empire: the nascent Congress-led independence movement and the alliance, specifically Germany. It is well documented in the directive issued by the Empire Intelligence Service in the year 1940 how radio was linked to intelligence gathering. And to quote, "We need our intelligence organizations on the spot, with headquarters in Bombay controlled and administered by a specifically chosen Indian." It is clear that the cooperation of All India Radio would be essential, but there is every reason to suppose that it would be cheerfully forthcoming. The organization would also be able to produce a skeleton service of information about Burma. So with these plans, the way the radio services were working in India was being changed by the British government. The first Director General of BBC, John Reith, who is acknowledged as the father of public service broadcasting, was expressing his interest in Indian broadcasting. He wrote to the Viceroy Willingdon on the issue of state-level broadcasting in India. Willingdon was quite interested in the idea that in 1934, he wrote back to Reith and he said that he would help Willingdon to find someone to work on a 5-year contract. Reith had written in his autobiography, and I quote, "Into the Wind," how he himself had mulled the idea of taking up the assignment only to be negated by the higher authorities. So even Reith was disappointed in this. The man selected from BBC was Lionel Fielding to shape up AIR on the lines of BBC. Fielding therefore was not quite happy with the use of broadcasting for intelligence activities, because he was a broadcasting person and he believed in taking news and other related aspects of information to masses. But Reith and Fielding's vision to build up broadcasting in India on the lines of BBC remained a very distant dream. It was made clear to Reith that AIR will not be modelled in the self-governing style of BBC. Rather, it would remain with the Industries and Labour Department, as it already was since 1930. This meant that the content that was being broadcasted through the radio services was going to be affected. Fielding was not happy with the name ISBS. He wanted a name which would have an all India identity and all India personality. He coerced the Viceroy, Linthing-Glow, into adopting the name All India Radio in the year 1936. Fielding recruited devoted young people, and with their help and his chief engineer Goida, he started Shortwave Transmission in 1938 and gave AIR a wider coverage. Lucknow station was then started on April 2, 1938, and Madras station was again started on June 16 the same year. In 1939, the Thrissur station went on air, and in the same year, the external services also started. Fielding went on medical leave in 1939 and returned briefly, only to permanently leave Indian soil by 1940. This was also a time when other hand people like Frank Lugard Bryan, a civil servant in the Gurgaon district, and few others advocated the usage of radio for uplifting the rural community. So way back then, even before the freedom times, people realized that this is a medium which could be used to benefit the rural community and to bring about development. This resulted in the establishment of rural radio stations, which were somewhat similar to the concept of community radio that is more prevalent now, about which we have spoken in the previous sessions. We will be shortly discussing it towards the end of the second session again. In places like the rural outskirts of the northern cities of Lahore, Delhi and Peshawar in southern Madras, Midnapur district of Bengal and princely state of Hyderabad. These stations were eventually incorporated into the All India Radio Network after the year 1937. Another very interesting development was taking place during this period. The Indian nationalist movement was at its peak, and the nationalist groups started exploring the issue of illegal counter broadcasting. So, from 1940 onwards, there have been evidences of amateur radio operators setting up pro-Congress stations like the Azad Hind Radio, etc. So now this radio station started operating on 26th of August 1942 after the arrest of Mahatma Gandhi, when All India Congress Committee decided to demand British to quit India. And with this illegal counter broadcasting, people would, especially the freedom fighters, they would put up stealthily small radio stations which would be able to transmit information over a period of, over a distance of a few kilometers, and messages related to freedom movement were able to be passed on to the general public. The station was broadcasting on 41.78 meters. As it was a secret radio, it had to be shifted many times to escape detection by the police. Historian Gautam Chatterjee said in his book, according to the old records, Vittal Rao Patwardhan brought a broadcasting equipment of the Congress radio called Azad Radio to Nasik. It was kept in Shankaracharya Mutt, from where the Azad Radio went on air. But perhaps fearing police raid, the transmission equipment was immersed in the Godavari river. Quoting Chatterjee, at those dark hours of new blackout, the Congress radio went on air and worked as an inspiration for the masses. It spread the message of secularism, internationalism, brotherhood and freedom. Ram Manohar Lohia and Vitthal Das Madhavji Khakar were given the responsibility to organize broadcasting messages and programs during the movement. Khakar was the chief organizer of the Congress radio enterprises and was directly answerable to Ram Manohar Lohia. According to Owen Williamson, we all know he's written famous books. Despite sporadic British jamming, the crystal controlled signal of Congress radio was audible on the then unoccupied 40-meter band throughout the Indian subcontinent and as far away as Japanese occupied Burma. So one can imagine the kind of danger and peril the British government was seeing in the broadcasting of radio services getting into the hands of the rebels. The station transmitted recordings of the Mahatma's sermons and calls for non-violence, uncensored news, pro-independence instructions for Gandhian activists, and political declaration by the movement's underground leadership. The first Indian administrator of AIR was A.S. Bokhari, who was groomed by Fieldon himself. He was the Director General during all the war years and during the independence movement and during the partition as well. A new broadcasting house was built on the Parliament Street in New Delhi. On June 3, 1947, Lord Mountbatten, who was the then Viceroy, and Jawaharlal Nehru and Muhammad Ali Jinnah gave their historical speeches through AIR. So I hope you found the journey so far highly mesmerizing. So this has been a historical mesmerizing state of affairs where radio is concerned, and in 5 good minutes join us back for the second session so that we can continue the story further. Thank you.